Hello, I'm Donald McCauley and welcome to medicsvoices.com, where we talk to the key opinion leaders in health and medicine around the world. Today I'm in Switzerland and I'm talking to Richard Budgett, the former Chief Medical Officer of the IOC. Richard, good to see you.
Thank you.
Richard, let me take you back to the very, very beginning, because you were born in Glasgow.
I was.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, obviously I can't remember it very well. I was there until I'm 18 months. And I, like many people in Britain, love to think of myself as Scottish or Irish or Welsh rather than English, because it has more of a romantic tang to it. So my heart is still in Scotland, but I left there even before I was 2 years old, hence the lack of a Scottish accent.
But there's a hint in the name. Now, I was fascinated because your name isn't just Richard Budgett, it's Richard Gordon McBride Budgett.
Yes.
So there must be a longer connection.
Oh yes, if I look at my heritage, it's more than half Scottish, probably more than three-quarters Scottish, with the Gordon clan and obviously the McBrides and the McElroys, and we've got a lot of roots in Scotland. And when I was young, we used to visit Scotland quite frequently because there were a lot of relatives there as well.
Well, then you moved south and you went to school in Radley. So that was interesting. Was that what started your sporting career?
Yes, I was one of those kids who was really very poor at sport, far too slow. I was always quite large and not very good at catching or throwing the ball. So introduced to rowing, and I was like a duck taking to water, and it went on from there.
So we have the sporting connection. Now, we need to talk about the sort of medicine. When did you get interested in medicine?
It grew, I suppose, through my teenage years, and I was always more interested in the sciences and biology, and really enjoyed physics and maths. But it was really the interest in people and the science behind it that attracted me to medicine. And so I made the decision that I think as many teenagers, 16, 17 years old, you don't know what you're signing up for. It's just a sort of myth that you have in your head about what it's like to be a doctor, but you mold yourself and you get molded into something that can actually work.
Well, one of the things that I'm always interested in is when you go to a school like Radley, which is very much a dedicated rowing school, how do you balance the academic and the sport? Was that a challenge? Or?
I don't remember it being a challenge. Because it's a boarding school, you're there a long time. Your days are long. So actually fitting in the training, which then wasn't as hard as it is now, was not a problem. It was built into the curriculum. Everyone was expected to do sport. You had your time to do sport. In my case, it was rowing, and then you had lots of time for the studying. And it never seemed to be shorter time for doing homework or studying or any academic pursuits. And then when it came to the racing and the regattas, they'd of course be at the weekends, so that wasn't an issue either.
So then we move you on to college. Tell us about college.
Yes, well, I went to Selwyn College, Cambridge, and I remember turning up, and I put right down the bottom of my details that I rowed, and they got very excited when they saw I was 2 meters tall. So I rowed. I really enjoyed my time at Cambridge, rowing for Selwyn College, and I actually trialled for the Blue Boat in my final year, and in 1980. And got to the last 20, but then got thrown out because I had very awkward rowing style. And it wasn't until I then went on to University of London to do my clinical that I actually came faster and went international.
Well, I smile when you say your awkward style, because you found yourself in 1981 in the ultimate boat, the Cox Pair. That was the boat for the big engine, and that was what really put you into the limelight.
It was out of nowhere, and I remember one of the headlines was "Cambridge Reject Gets Bronze Medal," and it surprised ourselves and everybody else. But that pair, we were only together for 5 weeks with another doctor, in fact, Dr. Thomas Cadew Hudson, and we were both at UL. We had a chance to have a pair to race at the World Championships. We won the selection, and then 4 weeks later we were racing against the East Germans and the Italians. And in fact, it was the very first race that the Abagnale brothers won. And then they won every single Cox Pair race until they were finally beaten by the Searle brothers in Barcelona. So it was a bit of history.
Well, again, let's get the little balance on the academic. How did that all fit in with your medical studies?
It was more challenging, I have to admit, when I was at UL, because they were very understanding, but you have to turn up to your clinical attachments, and fitting that around all the rowing commitments was very hard. And I really didn't expect to pass all my finals. I thought I'm going to have to retake some of them. But I negotiated basically a year off from 83 to 84. And they said, yes, you can delay starting your house jobs for a year so I could train full time. And that made all the difference. So I was suddenly able to, and we trained what we thought at the time was ridiculously hard, 3 times a day. None of us had ever done anything like that before, but it just raised the standard. And we went from being in the final but not near medals to actually, obviously, being medalist material.
Now, you brought up a very interesting point there, and that's the balance. Nowadays, academia seems to give a little bit for sport, but in those days, you were expected to do what everybody else did in medicine.
Yes, and we all dine out on the fact that most athletes, if you look at their academic achievements, they do really well, disproportionately well, because you have the discipline of having to fit it around your sporting endeavors. But undoubtedly, academia came first. So I was very lucky, I think, that the Middlesex Hospital where I was training actually were happy for me to take a whole year off. And that really made the difference. They did say if you don't come back after a year, you have to retake the finals. So that was quite sobering, but basically it was a fantastic difference.
Well, at the end of that year, you appeared quietly out of the mist in Lake Casitas, and that started a whole generation of it. That was a very interesting crew. Some very interesting people in that book.
Yeah, there were. Yeah, there was Steve Redgrave. None of us knew at the time that Steve was going to go on and win 4 more Olympic medals, let alone being dancing on ice as he is at the moment. Good luck to him. There was an article about us in the Telegraph, in fact, by Desmond Hill, and it labelled us as the unlikely lads. And we even got some T-shirts printed with the unlikely lads on them and raced in those at Henley, because it rather appealed to us because we were a real mixed bag with Martin Cross, who was actually a teacher at Hampton and does a lot of work in broadcast. And then there was Andy Holmes, who was always a challenging character and quite difficult, but very, very sadly, he died of Va's disease. It was, and then we had the Cox Adrian Ellison, of course, as well, who's a radiographer. So it was quite mixed. There were no other doctors in the boat, it just gelled. There was obviously the individual good talent, but actually bringing it together. And that's the great thing about rowing. Whatever the crew does has to be more than a sum of the parts.
But you were still trying to be a doctor, and you trained in general practice. Now, I'm not sure that many people know that. And I interestingly came across a book that you're named as one of the notable GPs. I think it's one of the 100 notable GPs.
I do remember that, yes.
So tell us about your training in general practice.
Yes, well, sport medicine, obviously, and sport and exercise medicine didn't really exist properly back then. It wasn't a speciality you could go into. So I was attracted to general practice from the beginning, and so started my GP training at Northwick Park Hospital in Harrow. And it just so happened, by extraordinary quirk of fate, that the British Olympic Association decided to set up their medical centre at Northwick Park Hospital. So I wandered down after it had been open for a few days. Didn't quite have my Olympic gold medal hanging around my neck, but more or less. And they said, yes, come and be involved, do some research. So then I had the job of actually thinking, well, what research shall I do? And I read around a bit and came across a lot of work done about testosterone and cortisol ratios and fatigue in athletes. And I thought, I'll do something like that. I'll use my rowers, all the people I've been racing with as guinea pigs, and we'll do some research. So I asked them, and they said, yes, do that. So that was the start of my interest, really, in what used to be called overtraining syndrome. It's really been fatigue in athletes, unexplained underperformance has really been my main interest in research since then.
Yeah, you were pretty much ahead of your time. That was really pioneering stuff in those days. And it's continued on, and not just in sport, it's really right across the whole of chronic fatigue. But you talked about the very beginning of sports medicine there, and of course, I think you were in the very first cohort of diplomates. Were you in the first?
Not the
group?
very first cohort, yes, but it was that was as soon as I finished my GP training it would have been about 88, 89. I then went to the London Hospital for a year and did the diploma in sport medicine. I think it'd been going for about 3 years then, but being founded by John King, larger-than-life orthopaedic consultant at the Royal London, who we owe so much to. And that really exposed me to BASM and all the community of sport medicine, I suppose. And I realized I didn't want to go full-time into general practice. Obviously, I couldn't afford to go straight into sport medicine. You know, there just wasn't a career to do that. So looked around for a half-time GP post, which I found in Acton, where I was living, and then stayed in London to build a career in sport medicine.
So take us through that career now in sports medicine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like anyone, especially in a speciality or non-speciality like sport medicine was then, you have to do a lot of it as volunteering. So I was lucky enough.
I should stop you there because people listening may not realise when they look at sports medicine now, where there is a very definite career path, that at that time there wasn't a career path. This was really putting it together yourself.
Yeah, it was just enthusiasts.
Yeah.
Really wanting to look after athletes. And there were some role models around that I could follow. And there was a doctor called Peter Thomas who'd been looking after the rowers, who was a great help to me. Malcolm Reed, who many of you will remember. So people had been practicing in sport as enthusiasts really before that time. And I was lucky enough to be offered the bobsleigh team. And was recruited famously by Michael Turner. I went to his office and he was looking after both the alpine skiers and the bobsleigh team. And he needed somebody to help him with the bobsleigh team and said, "Richard, you're big enough, you do it." So I took on bobsleigh in 1989-90 and really was involved with the bobsleigh team for the next 15, 16 years. And it is an extraordinary sport with a lot of similarities, funnily enough, to rowing, where you spend a lot of time tinkering with things, adjusting everything, getting ready. It's a crew sport. You're trained together, but of course it's all over in a few seconds rather than the minutes that you take going down a rowing course.
So you're with the bobsleigh team, but then you moved towards the main medical officer.
Yes, so then I was working, and my role at the British Olympic Medical Centre was converted from just being voluntary research, into an actual clinical post. So I was very fortunate then that I was actually employed by the British Olympic Association to work there through the hospital. And it was at the time really wonderful to have that medical centre there with all the connections to the consultants and facilities at Northwick Park Hospital. But it soon became apparent that we really needed more services, medical services, nearer to where the athletes were training. So that's an English Institute of Sport was created, and I became part of that, became involved with Bisham Abbey. And then it was about that time I could have enough of a portfolio to stop general practice. I'd already gone down from half-time to 1/3 time. And really, you can't do less than 1/3 time. My partners were very understanding and flexible to allow me to do that. And I enjoyed general practice. I particularly enjoyed working with the staff and the partnership and many of the patients. But I wasn't sorry to leave it because my passion was in the sport medicine.
So the passion was in sports medicine, and now you're involved you were at the English Institute of Sport now?
Yeah.
Those institutes of sport, that was a new dawn in sports medicine in the UK.
Yes, and it was, I think it was quite visionary. Everything came at once. The lottery funding, meant athletes could go professional. The coaches knew that there was some security and they could also be much more professional, and all the support staff. And through that, the support for these institutes. So being part of that at the beginning, it was modelled on the Australian Institute of Sport and really built up and there was, as you can imagine, with any sort of change like that, there are stresses and tensions. So you had the individual sports used to looking after themselves, want to be independent. They've got their own medical team, their own coaches, their own setup, and actually having someone coming in with a all singing, all dancing, multidisciplinary team working in an interdisciplinary way was very exciting for us there, but was quite new for many of the sports. So they had to adjust to that. But they did, and at Bisham Abbey we had the hockey team, the rowers, canoes, the canoe team, and various others.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging political environment because sport is always so focused and so determined to the exclusion of everything else. Bringing together groups of people like that must have been quite difficult.
I think it probably was, I wasn't responsible for recruiting and bringing the sports into the fold. That was done at a political level, but I suppose I was responsible for making sure that we delivered the sort of medical care that would keep them there and happy, and I was very pleased to be able to do that. So that time, yes, I was working for the British Olympic Association as the chief medical officer. I became I was Bobsleigh team doctor in 1992 in Albertville, and then 94 in Lillehammer, and then from 96 onwards, which was the Atlanta Games, was the chief medical officer for the Great Britain team. So that took 2 or 3 days of my time, and the other 2 or 3 days, it used to vary a bit, would be with the institute.
So then we've moved on, and now Olympic 2012. That must have been an enormous excitement, but a challenge at the same time.
Yeah, it was so exciting, and I would go back actually to 2007 when we won the bid, because when 2005 when we won the bid, because I remember being in Trafalgar Square, and none of us thought we were going to beat Paris. It was Britain and Paris, then suddenly the vote came through, and the London Olympics had been elected, just very, very close. And just that sheer euphoria and joy of everyone in that crowd, and realizing that actually it's going to change our lives. And it did. So I applied for the role of Chief Medical Officer for London 2012, started that in 2007, part-time, carrying on with my English Institute of Sport work as well, and then eventually became full-time, and had to deal with all the very different type of work, as you can imagine. You're not caring for a team. You're not worried about your team's performance. You're actually worried about the health of everybody coming to the games, with the athletes as a priority.
Was it fun?
It was fun, but not always fun. Sometimes it was a stress, and like any good job, sometimes it's a stress and a hassle, and you think, why does this have to happen? But most of the time, you have to pinch yourself and say, what a privilege to be part of this. It's just incredible. And of course, everyone was saying it's going to be a disaster. To be honest, this has happened every Olympics I've been involved with since, with the IOC as well. So many people say there's going to be a disaster and it's going to be terrible. We should cancel the games or postpone them or whatever. And then 9 times out of 10, they come off and everyone says, oh, what a triumph that was. It's just incredible. But London was no exception. There were all sorts of people saying, this is not going to work. It's going to be chaos. It's going to be terrible. And then the torch arrived. The atmosphere changed, and then by the time of the opening ceremony, and certainly by the time we got our first medals for Team GB, the atmosphere was electric, and everyone in their uniforms in public transport, everyone was talking to each other. The whole atmosphere in London was different. Any of you who were there will remember.
Could you relax?
Not until the end. I relaxed in the last few days, but yes, it was just hoping that there wouldn't be any curved balls coming out of nowhere that we hadn't predicted. And in fact, it's been the same with every Games. It is quite tense leading up to it, and then you slowly begin, as things begin to sort of the gears oiled and running smoothly, you can relax. I was quite relaxed, I suppose, for the Paralympic Games, because I knew we'd done the Olympic Games. The Paralympic Games is that much smaller, and there's a different atmosphere. People are much more sort of open, relaxed, and cheerful, whereas the stakes, I mean, obviously the stakes are incredibly high, but they're extraordinarily high for the Olympics, and it's very high profile. You really are in a goldfish bowl with the world looking at you. So
by this stage, after 2012, you'd done how many Olympics?
Oh, I couldn't calculate that up. I know now I've done 9 summer and 9 winter. But up till then, I'd have to work it out. Maybe half that.
So then you move on to be Chief Medical Officer for the IOC. So you've gone from the awkward medical student who couldn't make the blue boat to the #1 position in medicine in the Olympic organization. Tell us about that.
Yeah, well, it was a surprise, and I suppose, like many of the things one applies for in life, it does help if you don't really expect to get it, because then you're relaxed when it comes to the interviews. And I remember flying over I had 3 interviews actually through April 2012, before the games, coming over to Lausanne, and one of them, the plane was cancelled, and I had to get on a separate plane. I arrived about, I don't know, midnight or something for an interview at 9 o'clock the next morning. So it was potentially quite stressful, but I was totally relaxed because I thought this is just an adventure and it will be fine. And I got the role. I suppose looking back, I should have realized it does help to have an Olympic gold medal, and with the CV that, you know, I've done the games as a team doctor and then for the organizing committee. So, you know, I had the basics there to get it. But it was still an amazing feeling to suddenly get offered this role, and then quite a big decision, as it has been for my successor Jane, to decide, you know, am I going to move to Switzerland, disrupt my family, one of my children's education, and to completely change. You know, it's a big life step to move to another country, but I've never regretted it.
Now, people might think that being Chief Medical Officer for the Olympics is fun and enjoyment and one long party, but there must have been a lot of worries in those 12 years. Tell us about the major concerns that kept you awake at night.
Well, I often talk to people about the challenges and drama of each games, and the fact that with all of them there was something. Sometimes we didn't know about it at the time. And I was quite naive looking back. For instance, in the very first games I did with the medical director for the IOC hat was Sochi in 2014. And I remember arriving there and looking around the anti-doping laboratory and thinking, this is wonderful, I built this lovely new anti-doping laboratory. And even better, next door was the headquarters for the police. So it's going to be wonderfully secure. And I had no concept there was going to be a hole in the wall and the samples would be taken into the police station to be tampered with and emptied and the new samples put in. Unbelievable. You couldn't make it up. So that obviously, looking back afterwards, was the big stress of Sochi, which was otherwise a well-organized and successful games. But then there was Rio in 2016. Of course, there were all the challenges of sort of South American organization and the reassurances that it'll be fine. And in the end it was, but it was pretty close. And we benefited from João Grangeiro, who's the chief medical officer there, an ex-Olympian who really knew what was needed and managed, because he had great authority in medical circles in Brazil and in Rio, to push the essentials through and make it happen. But there, if you remember, we had calls from all over the world saying, cancel the games. You're irresponsible to hold them because of Zika. And there was an outbreak of Zika, and obviously that's very frightening for athletes, for support staff going there, if they might be pregnant, if they've got family who might be pregnant, and you got Zika, you know, the abnormalities that could result. So there were a lot of calls. We worked, and that was the first time I'd worked really closely with the World Health Organization. The WHO were hugely helpful, and undoubtedly that was quite stressful, with all these calls for the games to be cancelled or deferred. But in the end, there was not a single case of Zika in the Olympic Village. So we were all right. Again, it's another one that came good in the end. And then the other games, there was very often some public health issue, whether it was norovirus in Pyeongchang. We had a Youth Olympic Games in Nanjing during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, and several teams couldn't come because of Ebola. And then, of course, we had COVID. And that was, in many ways, just a miracle that the games, I know they were postponed for a year, but the fact that they actually happened in Tokyo, huge tribute to the Japanese to manage to put that on. It was really tough. You know, they're geared to holding the games in 2020, and then everything put on ice for a year. They had the MRI machine in place, So they had to keep it turning over for a whole year, and the expense and everything, unbelievable. And then it was so sad because we arrived in Tokyo, beautiful facilities set up, all ready for the spectators, because right until the last moment, hoping spectators would be able to come. Then the decision was made, no spectators. So you had all these empty stands, but the sport itself was great, and it was wonderful for the Olympians. I think it still looked good on TV. And so in many ways, the Olympics was a success, and it was saved, but at an extraordinary expense and effort. And stress, everyone being tested, being worried about turning positive, being worried about having to go into quarantine and isolation. It was people shouting at you saying, there's no way I was in contact with that person. We've all been through it during that time.
Richard, I'm so glad we're able to finish up looking at some of the difficulties in the job, because people can then appreciate what a wonderful job you've done. So thank you very much for taking us through your career, and thank you very much for everything you've done for sport and medicine and the Olympic movement. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.